Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. The program is Focal Point. The network is the American Family Radio Talk Network. It's interesting that George Zimmerman has resurfaced. Nobody's known where he's been. He's vanished from view. His parents are living in hiding. He's been living in hiding. And now I'm looking at a piece I just came across my desk as I came across the street to go on air, came over to the Focal Point studio, is that George Zimmerman has resurfaced, and it's a striking thing that he emerged to help rescue someone who was trapped in an overturned truck. Sanford Police Department Captain Jim McAuliffe told ABC News that Zimmerman, quote, pulled an individual from a truck that had rolled over at the intersection of a Florida highway last week. So there is George Zimmerman, and that just seems to be sort of his nature, to be someone who's looking out for other people. Someone wants to protect other people's safety, other people's property, other people's lives. So he has surfaced as a good Samaritan. Now, I want to play a couple of sound bites that deal with the whole issue of the Zimmerman case. I only want to spend one segment on this because I'm frankly kind of tired of talking about this whole thing, and partly because if we're going to get beyond race, we've got to get beyond race. In other words, the talking we ought to do about race is not about race. It ought to be, how do we get beyond the issue of race? How do we transcend the issue of race? What issues are far more important for us to talk about and concentrate on than the issues of race? And I've suggested from the very beginning of this whole controversy that our focus ought to be character and conduct. That's the only thing that we should be concerned about, is character and conduct. Remember, Martin Luther King Jr. invited us to judge his children based not on the color of their skin, but rather on the content of their character. And I believe he was exactly right. And you'll notice in that Martin Luther King Jr. didn't fall for the swill that we're not supposed to judge, we're not supposed to evaluate, we're not supposed to make moral judgments about the conduct and behavior of other people. He says, go ahead and do it. I dream of the day when you'll do that for my children, that you will judge them. I'm inviting you to do it. I ask you to do it. I ask you to evaluate them. But my dream is that when you come to judge my children, you will not look at the color of their skin, but that you will instead look at the content of their character. Now, I got a great soundbite in here. Let's see if we can grab this one first. It's the one from Dr. Ben Carson. Let's grab clip number 5, if we can, Rob, to start off with this. Ben Carson is the one that just resigned as the chief pediatric neurosurgeon. He's the best pediatric neurosurgeon in the entire world, just retired from Johns Hopkins University. And he was asked this question about this business of racial profiling and all of that, and he gave a really brilliant answer based on his own medical career. Let's listen.
Well, I think that we have a tendency to overemphasize superficial aspects of people. I was asked once by an NPR reporter why I don't talk about race that often, and I said it's because I'm a neurosurgeon, and she looked at me quite quizzically. And I said, you see, when I take someone to the operating room and I peel down the scalp and take off the bone flap and open the dura, I'm operating on the thing that makes that person who they are. It's not the covering that makes them who they are. It's the brain who makes them who they are. And that's what Martin Luther King was talking about when he said, let's talk about the content of one's character rather than the superficial characteristics. We need to tone down this rhetoric. Those of us in leadership positions need to be looking for things that we can take out of this situation that will be helpful, not things that inflame the situation. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't look carefully at all of our laws. We shouldn't look carefully at this verdict and at this outcome. Make sure that everything has been done correctly, the I's have been dotted, the T's have been crossed. But let's tone down the rhetoric and recognize that we, the people, are not each other's enemies.
So Dr. Ben Carson, kind of a great statement, and you think about what Dr. Martin Luther King was asking us to do. Do the same thing with another individual that Dr. Ben Carson does when he goes to operate. When he peels back the skin, it doesn't matter what the skin color is. It's irrelevant to him. It's immaterial to him. What matters is what's going on inside, underneath the skin, and that's the thing that we ought to be concerned about and we ought to care about. Now, this is in stark contrast to President Obama. Let's drop back to clip number 3, Rob. This is David Brooks. He is the Naugahyde conservative at the New York Times. I use Naugahyde because Naugahyde is fake leather. It's a pretend conservative. It's a fake conservative. It's a bogus conservative, somebody who calls himself a conservative but isn't a conservative in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But David Brooks is kind of the token so-called Naugahyde conservative at the New York Times. He's the guy that said President Obama was going to be an absolutely fantastic president, and he could tell it from the moment he saw him because of the crease in his pants. I mean, that's how superficial this guy is. This is how shallow his thinking is, that he was convinced that Barack Obama was going to make a great president because he took his pants to the dry cleaners and got impressed. I mean, that's the depth of this guy's analysis of President Obama. But he makes a very interesting admission here in his conversation with David Gregory on Meet the Press. This was yesterday. David Gregory says to David Brooks, I want to spend a few minutes talking about race. David Moranis, who wrote a biography of the president, writes this morning that his sense is that once the president had reached the White House, quote, it appeared that his intense interest in the subject of race diminished. He would be judged by the content of his presidency and not the color of his skin. Race seemingly became unimportant, if not irrelevant. He rarely spoke about it. And here is what David Brooks said about Barack Obama and whether race had become a superficial thing to him and he was beyond race or not. Let's listen.
Yeah, it seems superficially unimportant, but it's important to remember race is his first subject, as it would be if you had a black father and a white mother. And all the mental habits he brings to all the other issues grow out of the way he framed race and the way he started thinking about race, his tendency to do on the one hand, on the other, his desire to reconcile opposites, his ability to see different points of view. All the stuff we've come to see him apply to every other issue, it started with race. And I thought this speech was one of the highlights of the presidency. I thought it was a symphony of indignation, professionalism, executive responsibility, personal feeling. It had all these different things woven together, I thought, beautifully. But it's important to remember race is how he thinks.
That's an amazing thing to me. That is an amazing thing to me. You know, David Gregory quotes this biographer saying President Obama has moved beyond race. He wants to be judged based on the content of his presidency, not the color of his skin. And then David Brooks comes along and says, look, he just flatly contradicts it. It's important to remember that race is his first subject. All the mental habits he breached, all the other issues, grow out of the way he framed race and the way he started thinking about race. All this stuff, we've come to see him apply to every other issue. It started with race. And then David Brooks says, look, this speech on Friday, which was all about race, was one of the highlights of his presidency. But it was all about race. He hasn't gotten beyond race at all, according to David Brooks. And David Brooks is a big Barack Obama fan. And he's saying here, President Obama has not advanced one single solitary step beyond the issue of race. It's important to remember, last statement, race is how he thinks. Now, the next clip in the list there, let's grab clip number 4. This is Charles Barkley. Now, Charles Barkley is a former star in the NBA. They called him the round mound of rebound. He was a tough player. He's only about 6'6", but was one of the toughest inside players. No give, gave no quarter. One of the leading rebounders, even though he was giving up 4, 5, 6, 7 inches to everybody he was going up against in the lane. But he has the ability, I believe, to be objective about this George Zimmerman case. And he says, look, the media is part of the problem here. The media is corrupt. The media's hearts are blackened. Their hands have been dirtied on the issue of race. And he says, look, I've looked at the evidence, and I think the jury reached the right verdict. Let's listen.
Well, I agreed with the verdict. Yeah. I feel sorry that young kid got killed, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge him. Something clearly went wrong that night. Clearly something went wrong, and I feel bad for anybody who loses a kid. But if you looked at the case and you don't make it, there was some racial profiling, no question about it. But something happened to change the dynamic of that night. And I know, and that's probably not a popular opinion among most people, but just looking at the evidence, I agree with the verdict. I just feel bad because I don't like when race gets out in the media, because I don't think the media has a pure heart, as I call it. There are very few people who have a pure heart when it comes to race. Racism is wrong in any shape, form. There are a lot of black people who are racist too. I think sometimes when people talk about race, they act like only white people are racist. There are a lot of black people who are racist. And I don't like when it gets out there in the media, because I don't think the media has clean hands.
So that's Charles Barkley. I don't think the media has clean hands. He says, look, I'm a black and I can say this with credibility or believability or whatever, that blacks can be as racist as whites can be, and we should not be blind to that. Now, Charles Krauthammer, clip 2. Now, I'm not going to have time for that, Arby. Let's go back to clip number 1. Let's play the Ed Schultz clip, and then we'll come back and start next segment with the Charles Krauthammer clip. But Ed Schultz, he's on MSNBC, uber leftist. Interesting because I think he's actually onto something here. I rarely agreed with Ed Schultz. I just think my curriculum would be inspired by the same thing he's talking about here, but it would be completely different in its focus. And he's talking about whether in our public education system we ought to actually teach race relations as a subject in school. Here's what he had to say.
Tonight's question. Should there be a race relations class in every public school? Text A for yes, text B for no. Now, I'm going to vote yes on this. And you want to go to 67622. And you want to leave a comment on our blog at ed.msnbc.com. We'll bring you the results later on. But I believe that this has to be part of our public school discussion, that confrontation is not an option, that we need to love one another, and that loving your neighbor is what the Almighty wanted us to do. Now, if you're not faith-based, at least you can respect the human rights of someone else, so we can find common ground throughout this entire conversation.
You know, and I think he's exactly right. You know, I think it'd be good for us to have a course on race relations in our public school system. I think the curriculum, I think the textbook for that course in the public schools on race ought to come right out of Galatians chapter 3. It ought to come out of verses 26 and 27 and 28. In Christ Jesus, you are all sons of God, regardless of race or background. There is neither Jew nor Greek. Let's make that our text. Focal Point AFR Talk.